Dearest Heavenly Father, we thank you so much that you sent down the bread from heaven, that you gave us the bread of life, your Son, Jesus Christ. We pray, Father God, now that as we hear from your word, the words that I speak would come from you and from your Holy Spirit, Father God. Pray, Father God, that we would all be open to your presence and open to the ways in which you are working, not only in the things that we read in the scriptures, but in our lives. We pray all these things through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
So you know how some people are to-do list people? Like, they're people who know what they need to get done. They have a list. They manage to methodically work through it. They get all the way to the end of it. They're able to keep track of things along the way. I am not a to-do list person. At any given point in time, there's about 20 things that are bouncing around in my head. And I feel lucky if I manage to remember 10 of them. So a lot of things end up falling through the cracks, just being forgotten about. Mostly what I'm hoping is that the 10 things I did remember were the things that were actually important, and that the other 10 things were things that I could actually afford to put off and remember at some later time. So that's as close as I get to having a system for dealing with my to-do list. So I say this because when we're talking about our spiritual practices, I think a lot of us end up approaching it as a to-do list. So we have this list of things that we feel like we need to do to be good Christians, and then we spend a lot of our time comparing ourselves to that list and seeing whether or not we've checked off enough boxes. But whether you are someone who is a to-do list person, manages to get all the way through that list, or if you're like me and like maybe you get some of those things done on some days, or even if you don't check off any of those boxes, that is not what matters when we're talking about our spiritual lives. Because God meets all of us exactly where we are. It's not about what's happened before, what we have done, what we haven't done. It's about what's happening right now in this moment. It's about how God is meeting you here. And God will always meet us right where we are. Right here, right now. And we should never forget that. So with that being the case, as we're talking about following God's lead, I don't want to add something to your to-do list. If you're like me, it would just end up in that haze of things, that cloud of things that needs to happen, and may or may not. Well, what I want to talk about is a different way of seeing our spirituality, a different way of seeing how we connect with God. And it can be summarized in one phrase. It's only 5 words, but it's a really big concept that I'm still learning a lot about what it means. And it's finding God in all things. What does it mean to find God in all things? You know, for many of us, there are certain activities where we find it easy to notice God. We might find it easy to notice God during prayer, or while reading the scriptures, or when we're here, gathered in a worship service. There may be events where we can clearly see God moving. If we see God heal somebody and take away an injury or an illness, or if God answers a prayer by taking care of a practical need when we need a new place to live or we're looking for a new job. And there are places where we may find ourselves very aware of God. In a church, in a community group, if we're on a ministry trip here in Baltimore or in a foreign country. And all of these things do have special significance, but what can happen is a tendency to separate them out from the rest of our lives and to think that God is present in those things. And so in that process, what we do is we create this box of things where God is and a box of things where God isn't. We might talk about it as like a spiritual and a secular, or we might think about things that it's like this is Christian, this is not Christian. I know for me, like I grew up in a Christian household. And so this was something that the separation was reinforced on a regular basis, most of the time without realizing it. I think one of the big things is being born in the 80s. I grew up when Christian consumer culture was just really taking off. So some of the focus on the family, the movies, and the radio shows, the t-shirts, the rise of Christian bands. I went to a lot of Christian music festivals growing up as a kid. We had all of these different Christian activities that we would do with our church youth group. And it's not that those things are bad. A lot of those things were really good, and I really enjoyed them and enjoyed the fellowship and the company of people when I was at those festivals. But I also went to a public high school. And so I had a lot of friends who weren't into all of the Christian things. And I listened to a lot of the same music and watched a lot of the same movies that they did. And the message that came from church, sometimes intentional and sometimes not, was that those other things were not as good. Those other things were somehow less than the Christian version. And so if anything, being Christian meant that I was supposed to feel guilty about liking. I certainly was not taught that those were places where I could be encountering God. So I did learn a lot by growing up in a church. But one of the things that I didn't really learn is that God is a part of everything in our lives, not just the things that we attach the Christian label to. And what I've needed as a helpful corrective has been Ignatian spirituality. So this is a spirituality that was developed by St. Ignatius of Loyola. And in the 16th century, he developed a set of spiritual exercises that are intended to help people recognize where God is at work in every aspect of their lives. He also founded a religious order called the Society of Jesus, usually referred to as the Jesuits, that continues to use his exercises and principles he developed to this day. So over the last 5 centuries, people have been doing this and using this as a way of coming to better understand how God is at work in every part of their lives. And here in Baltimore even, there's actually, there's a Jesuit university, Loyola of Maryland. So they do continue to practice this, and there have been priests and lay people who for centuries have been refining this and making this a part of their lives, and have found in this a way to understand that God is a part of all things. And so the most distinctive aspect of Ignatian spirituality is that there isn't anything outside the scope of God's activity. There is no part of ourselves where God isn't speaking to us and working in us. All of our desires, all of our experiences, all of our feelings and emotions become an opportunity to listen and see what God is doing in us. I'll give one example from my personal life. I'm a huge sports fan. Anybody who knows me, has talked to me for any period of time, knows baseball, basketball, football, whatever team sport it is, I probably know quite a bit about it and spent a lot of time watching it. I actually would have loved to become a sports writer or a commentator. And now I would say that somebody can do those jobs and it would be just as spiritual in the way that they approach it as being a priest is. But growing up, while I would have said that was a big part of my personal identity, I would not have connected it to something that had to do with my faith. I've started to see that differently, and to recognize that God can be at work even in my love for sports. I grew up in a military family, and one of the things about being an Army brat is that you move a lot. And what happens when you move a lot is that you start to feel like you're not from anywhere. I was placeless. People would ask me where I was from, and I'd have to explain, well, I was born here, and then I went there, and then I was here for a little while, and then I went there, and then I came back there, and then I did this and that. What helped me to actually form a connection to a place was being a Boston sports fan. Yeah. Not everybody necessarily relates to that. But that was a part for me that was important, because what I had to do was to be able to see myself as being from a place and understanding that type of connection, and recognizing that being placeless actually meant that I was disconnected. It meant that I didn't understand where I came from. And so it's being a Boston sports fan, like being part of Red Sox Nation and following the Patriots and the Celtics. That's what taught me how important it is to come from somewhere, to know where you're coming from, and to learn to love that somewhere because you were a part of it. My love for place, which is an important part of how I relate to people and how I relate to God, I can trace that back to going to Fenway Park and watching the Red Sox play games there. And I say that because there is nothing wasted in who we are, or in what we do, or in what we spend our time. There is nothing that is a part of us that isn't part of how God wants to speak to us. When I talk about the importance of finding God in all things, I mean all of them. Not some things, not sometimes, not some places. God is there, exactly, the whole time. God is there in everything. So if there's nothing else you hear me say today, I want you to hear this. God is always present in every part of our lives. So the question is, how do we learn to see the world that way? How do we start to notice what God is doing in everything that's happening, not just the spiritual things? We don't always see where God is at work, and we often have things getting in the way of our vision. So how do we start to adjust our perspective? I think there are three things that we need to pay attention to. The first is openness. We have to be ready to hear from God in unexpected ways, and for God to speak to us about any part of our lives. Father James Martin, who was a Jesuit priest who writes about Ignatian spirituality a lot, he puts it this way. In Ignatian spirituality, there is nothing that you have to put in a box and hide. Nothing has to be feared. Nothing has to be hidden away. Everything can be opened up before God. We have to be willing to trust God with all of ourselves. There's not a spiritual part of our lives where God belongs, because God is there in our work, in our relationships, in our free time, and God is looking to speak to us in and through all of those things. I think one of the biggest adjustments for me has been to recognize that God wants to include all of me when we're spending time together. I'm a rational person, so I sometimes get stuck focusing on what I think about God or what I believe about God. And so I leave the relationship on that more rational side of myself. But God's speaking to us in our emotions. How we feel can be an important part of recognizing where God is present in our lives. So we have to bring those emotions into our prayers. God even works through our imaginations. So much of prayer in the Ignatian tradition is actually visualizing the stories of the scriptures and putting ourselves there and imagining what it would be like to speak to Jesus or to have a conversation with God in those places. And allowing God to guide us in our imaginations to see God's presence in those stories. So whatever you're bringing to prayer, God can meet you there if you're open to it. The second thing to remember is presence. If we are finding God in all things, then we need to believe that God is always present. There is no time or place where God is absent from our lives. But we are not always present to God. There are plenty of places where we might be showing up, but we're not really present. For me personally, I am not a conference call person. I might be on the line, but I can almost guarantee I'm probably not truly present. There's a whole lot of people trying to talk together over the phone. The line is open, but I'm not there. Being somewhere is one thing, but actually bringing our presence with the entirety of our attention, our ability to zero in on something that matters to us, that's a totally different thing. And the fact that we can't be present to everything around us it's actually a big part of what it means to be human. We have limits on what we can pay attention to. There's only so much we can be noticing at any given point in time. So I want everyone to stop and close your eyes for just a second. Right now, as you keep them closed, try and visualize what this room looks like. What are you seeing? Who do you notice sitting in the seats? What furniture do you see up at the front of the room? What kinds of things do you notice if you try to picture what the back of the room looks like? Do you see anything in the ceilings? What can you remember is on the stage? What colors do you see as you're looking around? Go ahead and open your eyes. And now look around the room again. Look to the front, to the back, up. How many things did you not notice when your eyes were closed? How much of this room could you actually recreate in your mind? And what kinds of things did stand out to you? Because those were the kinds of things that you were being present to. Hopefully you realize that I was up here at the front of the room. You probably were more aware of what was here in the front because of the way everything is set up. This is important, what's up here. You probably didn't notice anything in the back. You probably didn't remember that there's tables that are set up back in that balcony pew. You might not have remembered the fire exit signs. Our attention is being directed certain places. And so we are present to very specific things. And what we have to learn is with our attention and with our presence is to start noticing where God is. And to start actually recognizing where God is active and how to make ourselves fully present to what God is doing in this specific moment. It's a process. It's something that we learn over time to see where God might be at work in our lives and how to pay attention to what God is saying to us in the midst of everything else that's going on. And that comes down to the third piece that I want to talk about, which is discernment. When we're looking to pay attention to what God is doing in our lives, we have to figure out what is God doing, and where is God present, and where is God at work, and what are the distractions that are pulling us away from that. And the things we might consider to be distractions might actually be the things where God is working in our lives. So we have to learn over time, because if we're finding God in all things, then it's not that we're stopping our non-spiritual activities. It's that what we're learning to do is see, what is it that God's doing when I'm at work? What is it that God's doing when I'm spending time with my family? Like, those aren't things that are outside the scope of what God does. So how do we start to discern what it is that God is saying in those moments? I think one of the things that I've learned a lot over the last few months is to start to see God in what many of us might consider to be one of the least spiritual activities, which is politics. I ran for office for a local position. And I think a lot of times when we think about politics and what's going on there, we see so much of a focus on winning and on taking power over other people, being able to defeat other people on the other side so that we can carry out our own agenda. And when those kinds of things are what we're focusing on, it's really easy to miss how God might actually be present and working in a political campaign. So how do we discern how God is at work? If we can truly find God in all things, where is God present and running for office? What I started to notice was mostly when I was knocking doors, going throughout the district. It wasn't about outcomes. It wasn't about all the things that we usually think and associate with politics. Where I found God speaking to me was every time I knocked on somebody's door somebody came and we started talking about what they cared about. And I was there to listen and to talk about what it was that we could do to address their concerns, or to help them fulfill the hopes and the dreams that they had for their neighborhood. It was every conversation that I had, every relationship that was being created, every time that we, both me and the person I was speaking to, felt like there was actually things that could happen to make Baltimore more of what we all want it to be. It didn't matter how short the conversation, how long the conversation was, that was always an opportunity to connect with somebody. The other thing I noticed, even when I wasn't talking to people, was just taking steps through the neighborhood. Was just physically walking through all the communities in North and Northeast Baltimore. It's that act of walking drew me closer to that place, and to realizing that every place that we're in has a story. And that in the story of Baltimore's neighborhoods, there's so many. There's so many different things that are happening that we get used to. I think particularly in Baltimore, we get used to one story being told about this city, but there's so many different things that are happening, and there's no way to replace actually walking through a neighborhood and just feeling what it's like to be there. And so every time that I talked to somebody at the door, every step that I took, that's how I was being drawn closer into what God was doing in this city. And so that is the question that it comes back to for all of us. Where is God in what you're doing every day? Where is God in every moment that you're spending time? Where is God in each of the conversations that you have? Each of the things that you want or that you have to do? All the places where you find yourself. Whatever we're doing, God is there. So our spiritual practice is not just about setting aside time and saying this is the spiritual things that we do. But it's developing this constant awareness of where God is and how God is present. So I want to finish by allowing us to have some time to practice this kind of awareness right now. So feel free to close your eyes or keep them open, whatever you feel comfortable with. But the first thing I want you to do is just to quietly open yourself up to God. Clear out the distractions, clear out the things that might be bouncing around in your head. I'll sometimes picture the distractions as bubbles in my head, and then pop them so that they go away. But do whatever it is that makes you feel comfortable to set aside those concerns for the time being. And then tell God that you're bringing all of yourself to this conversation. Not just the parts you'd like to bring, not just the parts that you've been told or reported, but everything that you're feeling, everything that you're thinking, everything that you've been experiencing. Bring that all to God. Make it all available for God to use.